it. The kinds of risks that are present in it. I mean, there are risks, but addiction is not one of them.
If that's the case, why have these compounds been so difficult to research? Why are they not freely available? I mean, what happened that took them off the table for so long?
Well, I mean, the '60s happened. There's a chapter in the book where I look at the sort of rise and quick fall of psychedelics during the '60s, and it's a really fascinating episode, and it's full of cautionary tales. It's funny. I would ask researchers I was interviewing, so what happened? Why was there such a backlash against psychedelics, that research was closed down? That never happens, that you have a promising field of research and suddenly scientists feel they can't do it anymore and they're told to stop. I mean, this is kind of Dark Ages stuff. And to a man, and they are mostly men, I'm afraid, they will say, well, it's too simple to blame Timothy Leary. And then they'll go on to blame Timothy Leary. And he does have a very important role in this. And basically, Leary, started studying psilocybin and then LSD at Harvard from 1960 to 1963. And keep in mind, the drugs were legal then. But he got impatient with research, with science pretty early on, and he decided, well, you can't really do a controlled study of psychedelics, so why bother? And he started studying psychedelics in what he called a naturalistic environment, which meant, his living room. And as happens to some psychedelic researchers, they lose interest in treating individuals and acquire an interest in treating the whole of the culture. Because they start seeing that, retailing these things is too slow when they're so promising and they could actually save us from civilizational collapse. And you have this exuberance, irrational exuberance, I would add, that seems to come up in the minds of some people who work with these compounds. And it's an occupational hazard, I would argue. And the current generation of researchers are guarding against it, but take them out for a drink and, they'll come around to that place, the value of these compounds for the whole civilization, which is interesting, and they may well be right, but it's a dangerous way to talk, I think. And so something else was going on in the '60s, and that was that these drugs were used by the young, by teenagers and people in their 20s. And it created what was called a generation gap, and a very unusual splitting of the cultures and values of two generations. These drugs were doing something very unusual to that historical moment, and something that will never happen again. Let me explain what I mean. LSD, a high-dose psilocybin or LSD trip, is a kind of rite of passage, a searing rite of passage. You feel like you went in one person and you came out another person. And it did this for the young at that point. That's who used these drugs. Not too many older people use them. Normally, a rite of passage knits a culture together. It's organized by the elders who set up the bar, whatever it is, whether it's a bar mitzvah or a vision quest or whatever it is, and the youth, the adolescents, pass through that process and then land in the country of the adults. And that's how you grow up. Here was this really freaky rite of passage that was taking young people and dumping them in a country of the mind that adults knew nothing about. And I think it really drove a wedge in the culture. And it's no accident that you had this unusual divergence of youth culture, both in terms of everything from politics, dress, music, diet, sexual mores, morality. was different than adults, and that was very destabilizing for the culture. And not surprisingly, the elders reacted with fear and panic, and tried to put an end to this. Richard Nixon called Timothy Leary, who was already kind of a washed-up psychology professor, called him the most dangerous man in America. That's astounding. But he probably really believed it. He believed these drugs were keeping men from going to fight in Vietnam. One of the things that happens is that these drugs make you raise questions about the authority structure that you live in, and that was certainly happening. So they were very destabilizing, and there was a backlash. Whether Timothy Leary was solely responsible for that seems unfair. I mean, he was definitely the East Coast person most responsible for it. But remember, on the West Coast, you had Ken Kesey, the writer, who is turning on thousands of people in his acid tests, and is also a psychedelic evangelist. And he was turned on by the CIA inadvertently. They were testing their LSD, and they were paying people $50 to go to the VA hospital in Menlo Park or Palo Alto and have a dose, and they turned on the wrong guy for that one. And
the story is so outrageous,
isn't it? It's like a movie.
I mean, I'd never been exposed to the details in your book, and it's just, if someone were to write a novel with that as the plot, I mean, they'd have to be like Haruki Murakami or something. It's so surreal.
Yeah. And the idea that the 60s, what we call the 60s, might have been a CIA mind control experiment gone horribly good or bad,
yeah,
is mind blowing. So I think the drugs would have found their way into the counterculture one way or the other. There were other routes besides Timothy Leary, even though he was pushing really hard to make this happen. But that led to a backlash, and you had the government coming down hard on it. The media, who had and this was one of the real surprises in researching the book, incredibly boosterish about psychedelics. Time Life, which was one of the most important media empires in the country, controlled by Henry Luce, they were actively promoting psychedelics up until 1965. Henry Luce loved them. He and his wife had been treated successfully. He published Gordon Wasson's first account of a magic mushroom experience in Mexico in the 1950s. And in fact, he insisted that all coverage of psychedelics come to his desk so he could make sure it didn't have anything negative in it. So the culture undergoes a radical 180 around 1965. And that leads to the closing off of research. So that begs the question, could it happen again? I don't think it could happen quite that way. And the reason it couldn't, and for this idea, I credit Rick Doblin, if he's right. And but he might be wrong. But Rick Doblin, who's the head of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, thinks that the culture has changed too much, that we've absorbed so many innovations of the 60s, and that the people now in charge, many of them have tripped. Psychedelics are not so strange to them. And that's why you have, really some establishment voices in the psychiatric establishment. People like Paul Summergrad and Jeffrey Lieberman, both past presidents of the American Psychiatric Association, have talked about their own use of psychedelics and the role it played in their intellectual development. No doubt, some of these regulators at the FDA have, first-person experience of psychedelics, so they're not terrified of them in quite the way our parents were, or my parents were in the 60s. And I think there's some comfort in that for people doing this research, that it's unlikely to happen that way. Could it happen another way? Yes. I mean, let's say someone dies in this research, or there is, some adverse, events, or there are suicides associated with psychedelics, which have happened in the past and could happen again. The cultural climate could change. We also have Jeffrey Sessions is the attorney general, and he's not content. He's not happy with states legalizing cannabis. How's he going to feel if the FDA comes forward and approves psychedelics? It's not guaranteed that they'll be against it. I mean, there's another lens you could take to this. They are deregulators, and that's essentially what we're talking about, right? Is deregulating a pharmaceutical.
Can I jump in for 1 second? I'm so curious. Do you not think there would be incredible backlash if a Sessions or someone else were to come out against phase 3 trials that are specifically dealing with, say, victims of sexual assault for PTSD, war veterans returning with pronounced trauma and limbs blown off? I mean, it seems to be such a bipartisan issue and in everyone's best interest. There would seem to be some political risk in trying to stop these types of studies. Maybe I'm not savvy enough.
I think you're absolutely right, and your example is the good example. I mean, the MDMA work for PTSD. I mean, this is, is there a more sympathetic population that you could possibly be helping? And in the same way, the whole system finally was moved to make it easier to have access to AIDS drugs because there was nothing else that could help. I think that, yes, I think there would be a penalty. And I don't think it's an accident. It's not a right-left issue when you start talking about the military and cops. Rebecca Mercer has donated to research, to psychedelic research, specifically, I think, with the PTSD work. Steve Bannon has spoken out in favor of it. So, and Peter Thiel is an investor in psychedelic medicine. So it isn't necessarily the case that it's regarded as this left-wing thing, even though it has these countercultural, colorations. So I don't think it's simple at all. But we'll see. We'll see. If the FDA looks at these phase 3 results, and this is a couple years down the road, and says that, yes, these drugs should be approved and doctors should be able to prescribe them, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is part of the Justice Department, then has to reschedule them. Scheduling drugs is a political determination, finally, and DEA has sometimes been immune to scientific information. But I think it would be, an interesting moment. I'm not sure how it would come out, but I think that this work with dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and dealing with the so-called existential distress of cancer patients wins the sympathy of the public, especially when you're doing it with a drug where the risk profile is really not very bad. So we'll see. I mean, I think it's a big question. The idea that there's any kind of logical response on the part of the Trump administration to anything, that has to be factored in too.
So you mentioned risks earlier. I think we should talk about that. I mean, what is the risk profile? Right? What are the risks of these compounds? What's the LD50? If we have 1,000 people in a room, what's the dose it takes to kill 500 of them?
Well, there's no known lethal dose of psilocybin or LSD. That's if it kills you, it's not going to be because it's toxic. They're not toxic. Remarkably few molecules have this profound effect, and they don't stay in your body that long. So from a toxicity point of view, they're remarkably safe drugs. I think that the risks are more psychological in origin. They are incredibly disruptive. They disarm your usual defenses, and defenses, can be very helpful as well as hurtful. And some people without their defenses get into real trouble. People do foolish things on psychedelics. People take them carelessly and they, walk into traffic. They step off of buildings. So I think, and then there is a small subgroup of people at risk for serious mental illness, things like schizophrenia, for whom psychedelics can be the trigger. And push people into that first psychotic break. And I think that that happened, it wasn't so uncommon with people in their early 20s using these drugs, and that happens to be the age where this tends to happen. Would it happen without the psychedelics? Probably another trauma would have set it off, if not the psychedelics. But it does happen, and I think that one of the reasons that there have not been any adverse events, any serious adverse events in the 1,000 volunteers that have been dosed in the modern era of research, is that they're screening very carefully. Anybody who's got mental illness in their family is not eligible. So, that's kind of the luxury of doing small trials. You can be very picky about who you give the drug to. And that's one of the reasons that phase 3 may not be quite as dramatic in its success as phase 2 has been. So I think that there are people who should not take these drugs, and it's people at some psychological risk. That said, it's worth pointing out. There's a story I tell in the book that very often doctors who, in the 60s especially, who weren't familiar with psychedelics and the phenomenology of them, mistook panic attacks, simple panic attacks, which are common on the drugs, for psychotic breaks. And there's a great story that Andy Weil told me, Dr. Andrew Weil, about after he got out of medical school in 1968. He hustled out to San Francisco and volunteered at the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, and they were seeing lots of bad trips. And people would come in and they thought they were going mad, that they were going to die. And we shouldn't minimize how bad a bad trip can be. It's a terrifying experience, and that too is a risk, even if it is just a panic attack. But Andy had a lot of experience with psychedelics himself, and he saw these symptoms for what they were. And what he would do is he'd come into the little cubicle with his white coat and his stethoscope and his clipboard, and he'd ask a few questions. And then when he decided the person was not really psychotic, but was just freaking out, he would say, "Excuse me, but there's someone in real trouble in the next cubicle." And all at once, these people were like, "Wow, there's someone more fucked up than I am." And they would feel so much better. and their symptoms would pass. So he understood that you could manipulate the experience, which is, of course, what the guides understand too, and rescue someone from what had been a pretty horrifying episode. So, how many psychotic breaks were there in the 60s? You hear, that there were, the emergency rooms were, for a period, were, full of people on bad LSD trips. And maybe that's true, but what was that actually? It may have just been a bad trip. And bad trips are first, they can be averted with good guiding. And second, they can actually be very useful to people if they're properly analyzed.
And I think at least, the way that I've started to think about this, reading your book and becoming involved with the research, is that maybe a more useful delineation is safe and unsafe trip, in the sense that difficult does not necessarily translate to long-term negative outcomes. In some cases,
to the contrary,
very, very much the contrary.
Yeah.
And I want to pause for just a second here to make an appeal if there are regulators, lawmakers listening, and that is that, speaking as someone who I assure you is not dancing around the playa in a thong at Burning Man calling himself a shaman. That's not my shtick, but conversely has looked at mental illness in friends, suicide in friends in high school and college, have friends with, say, eating disorders of 20, 30 years that have been not just mitigated, but resolved. At least I can't say definitively, of course, but for years now, after, say, 1 to 3 controlled sessions. Looking at the risk profile of these drugs, there are risks, to be sure, but the potential benefit, the cost effectiveness, and the pronounced favorable risk profile is really remarkable. I mean, beyond just about anything I've seen. Not a panacea, but with some very promising indications that make it, at the very least, worth researching in depth. And I don't want to sound too much like I'm proselytizing, but if you look at, say, there are drugs, looking at my pharmacogenomics, if I were to take them, I could have a fatal response, right? Which are common drugs. If you take grapefruit juice, which can certainly change the metabolism of many drugs, you can have horrible side effects. And if you were to print out, let's just say hypothetically, years from now, you have psilocybin available, and you go to Walgreens to pick up your psilocybin, and maybe it's only available through a therapist or a doctor who's going to be supervising a session. But nonetheless, let's imagine this is an exercise, and you pick up your little white bag with the pharmacist's directions and warnings on the side. Compared to just about anything else to date that I would have routinely consumed, the profile of something like a psilocybin would be very, very favorable for a lot of things. And of course, we're operating from a place of incomplete information just because the research has been so stymied, but the early indicators seem to be really promising. So I would just say from the standpoint of regulators, not calling it the sort of the golden goose, but some of these compounds have the potential to transform how increasingly problematic, often fatal problems in mental health and elsewhere are treated. So
I agree with you entirely, and I think that yes, as with any drug, you've got to compare it with other drugs, and that they all have risks, and we put up with a certain amount of risk to get the benefit. And that the risks in this case, certainly at the biological level, are minor compared to drugs we take routinely that even over-the-counter drugs that are more toxic than psychedelics, as far as we know. So I think that's definitely worth keeping in mind. Because these drugs are illicit, they're surrounded by this penumbra of fear.
That's a good word, penumbra.
And we need to like look at them with a very kind of cool, objective lens, which is hard to do. David Nutt, who's a very well-known psychopharmacologist in England, who's involved with the research. It's in his lab that Robin Carhart Harris works. He did a very interesting analysis of a bunch of drugs, and he would compare them not even to themselves, but to other kinds of risky behavior. And he got in really hot water. Not only did he say that alcohol is more toxic than LSD, which got him fired. He was working for the government as the Labor government's drugs advisor. But then he said riding a horse is more dangerous than taking MDMA. Now, we never put those two things together, but why don't we have this conversation about horseback riding? It's really dangerous.
I'm just seeing the commercial, like the 30-second spot, safer than riding a horse.
So, I think I think we're really nuts. I mean, in general, any behavioral economist, I'm sure you've had them on the show, will tell you that we're nuts about risk and really irrational in how we confront it. So it's important to understand that there are risks. They're mostly psychological. People can have very painful experiences. But in terms of poisoning your body, you could do a lot worse.
And one of the portions in your book that really caught my attention and got me excited was related to the default mode network. And I'm probably going to butcher this paraphrasing, so I want you to correct me. But it was the observation that perhaps some of these conditions that a layperson is prone to thinking of as separate, whether that's chronic anxiety, chronic depression, OCD, eating disorders, that they may not, in fact, be as separate as we think. And I want to say that Dr. Tom Insel may have commented on this, former head of the National Institute on or of mental health. Yeah. Could you just elaborate on that? Because it's so exciting to me for many reasons that I want to do it justice. So could you explain this?
I'm glad you brought that up because it's one of the most exciting things in the book, I think. And I talk about this idea that we may be close to or see a path to developing what I call the grand unified theory of mental illness, or at least a big set of mental illnesses that include depression, anxiety, addiction, and obsession. And one of the questions I asked Insel when I interviewed him was, and this is, one of the things I was skeptical about, that it seems kind of implausible to me that one drug or one, category of drugs like psychedelics should work on so many different indications. Isn't that a little too good to be true? Isn't that, aren't you talking panacea? And he said, well, what makes you think those indications are so different? Those illnesses are so different. And he said the distinctions between depression, anxiety, obsession, and addiction are actually, there's a lot of bleeding over from one to another. And that the names that we give them are really an artifact of the insurance industry and the DSM, the diagnostic manual. We have to assign a number to every diagnosis, and so we tend to separate things. And but he's kind of more of a lumper, and he suggests that these could be very similar phenomenon. And that, one way another psychiatrist put it is depression is kind of regret about the past, and anxiety is regret about the future. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. They are, the real difference between depression and anxiety is tense, isn't it? And so when you step back to another level and you look at the mechanisms that may be at work here, you begin to see how these illnesses may be very similar. How do I mean? Well, if you look at, again, go back to Robin Carhart Harris's work on the default mode network, his premise, he wrote another really interesting paper. Anyone who has an appetite for a little neuroscience should check out this paper. It's called The Entropic Brain. And you should put it on your website. I can send you a PDF.
I'll put it in the show notes. Mm-hmm.
And there his idea is that the brain is, as we know, a very complex system, and it has an order, an emergent order that is to some extent enforced or regulated by the default mode network. And the ego is the felt version of that. And the ego's job is to kind of patrol the boundaries. All right. It's the cop on patrol, and it's patrolling the boundary between you and the other, things that aren't you and your unconscious. And the system, has this kind of structural order, but in many people, that order gets overly rigid, and that brains function along a spectrum from entropy to rigidity. And on the entropy end, you have serious psychological ailments like schizophrenia, and you also have childhood consciousness, which is very chaotic and very psychedelic in many ways. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you get to these illnesses characterized by too much order, essentially. And that's depression and obsession and addiction. And these are essentially ailments where people get stuck in repetitive loops, that these deep grooves of thought and behavior, which are enforced by an ego that's become almost punishing, too authoritarian. And so these brains are kind of locked, and these other brains, are just way loose. And there's a place you want to be in the middle there. There's a point of criticality, really, where you have enough entropy, but also enough order, and that we go wrong when we get too far to one end or the other. That's his theory, anyway. It's speculative, but has a lot of explanatory power. And basically, he thinks that psychedelics work by increasing the amount of entropy in the brain. And that entropy, up to a point, is a very positive thing. And that it is the lack of entropy that traps people in these very rigid patterns of thought and behavior. And that essentially the LSD or the psilocybin lubricates cognition. It can go too far and leads to magical thinking, which is also on the too much entropy side. But it also can help break people out of those habits. So there you begin to see the outlines of a grand unified theory of mental illness, and that's really exciting stuff.
It makes me think of, it's so exciting because it sort of offers this tantalizing possibility that you could address many different separately labeled conditions in a similar way. And I'm not going to name names, but I was speaking with a researcher in this field, very well published scientist, and the analogy that he used, and I'm going to modify it a little bit, but he said that, because my question to him was, what is it? What is a plausible explanation for why some of these compounds seem to have this long-term reorganizing effect? Because the half-life of the drug, so to speak, is not months long. So, like, what the hell happens where these people, in some cases, have this persistence of personality change where they have more empathy a year later, 2 years later? What on earth can explain that? And the picture he painted, because the mechanisms are still so poorly understood, was, well, you can imagine if you're on a ski mountain.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
All right. After a few hours, you have all these worn ruts, and it becomes more and more likely that people are going to use the ruts that have been laid down. But if there's
you can't get out of them, right? Your sled or your skis keeps tending back into them, and you're yes.
And so, but if you suddenly have 5 feet of fresh powder, whatever, 3 feet, it doesn't really matter, and then you get up to the top of the lift, you all of a sudden have to, almost by definition, choose a new path. You're at least given the flexibility to choose your new route. And but taken too far, it's just like being stuck in a blizzard, right? Well, that's not going to. That's my own addition. Yeah. Not terribly original, but it's I really need to meet Robin at some point. I haven't.
You do. You need to have him on. He's a brilliant guy, and I think he will be recognized as a really important neuroscientist. He's just got a very unusual mind because he can do the hard science, but he's also trained as a psychoanalyst. He's actually a Freudian. Very, very interesting mix of. He got into this because he wanted to show the psychological, the neuroscientific basis for Freudian ideas like repression. And so, yeah, he's a really interesting guy. I think that snow metaphor is really powerful. We don't understand the mechanism. What exactly is filling those ruts, in a way that lasts? I mean, I think, though, it may go back to that image of, creating some new linkages in the brain, some new pathways. And basically, that's what learning is. It's a pathway in the brain, and then you reinforce it by repetition. So that if you have had such a linkage on an experience and you simply think about it a lot, and I've certainly done this in my own experiences, it reinforces it. You can use meditation to reinforce it. You can just replay it in your head. And in time, you're creating a more and more resilient linkage. And that's why I think that the integration period after the session is so important. In all the both underground and above ground guided sessions, there are 3 stages. They prepare you for it. They guide you. They sit with you while you're having the experience. And then you always come back the next day. And this is probably the most important part, to figure out what the hell was that all about. And it's often hard to know. And many of us take a big psychedelic experience and we put it in this box called weird drug experience, and we put it away on the shelf because we don't know what to do with it, and no one's going to help us. But at the integration, the guide will have you talk out your experience, tell the narrative, and then we'll kind of underscore certain ideas. And I remember well some times I had when I had good guiding that they would, by emphasizing one particular theme or insight or image, basically make that linkage much stronger than it would have been, and it became the thing that I thought about the most, and then was and acquired a certain kind of power in my mind. So I think that there's a lot more to be done with figuring out how to take elements from the experience and kind of reify them and make them more real and more lasting.
Michael, this seems like a good time to get into those personal experiences.